I got a question from Dylan, and Dylan asked, I've got a question about protein metabolism. Was looking at a paper. Protein overfeeding resulted in no gains in body fat, even though the average caloric increase was around 800 calories. So Dylan was wondering if there's even a possible mechanism that our body can use to convert amino acids into free fatty acids and then store them ultimately as fat tissue. So basically, the question was, the root of it. There are a couple papers uh, looking at very high protein overfeeding, and in those papers, there's a curious lack of fat storage. So basically, they said, hey, have these really high protein intakes. We're talking upwards of 3 or 4 grams per kilogram per day. So, the RDA for protein in America, the guideline says to shoot for like 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. We're talking about in these overfeeding studies, 3.5, sometimes even close to 4.5 grams per kilogram, which is a ton of protein. But in the course of these studies, these individuals who were free living individuals were instructed, hey, eat these really high protein intakes, but keep doing your thing, lift some weights, we'll see what happens. And so over the course of 8 weeks, in one of these studies, there was really a series of 3 of these overfeeding studies by Antonio and colleagues. In one of them, for example, like the poster mentioned here, theoretically, the high protein group was eating like 800 extra calories compared to the control group. And over an 8-week span of time, they did not seem to accumulate any additional fat mass compared to the other group eating 800 fewer calories. And that is a really astronomical calorie gap between groups. So before I get into some of the applied research on the topic, the first part of the question was, is it even possible for us to really do anything with these extra calories that are coming from protein overfeeding? Can we use them for energy? Can we store them for fat? And the very simple answer is yes. So our body is pretty good at stuff, which is one of the reasons that there's so much argument in the nutrition world, is because like you can go on a really wide range of diets and feel pretty okay. And if you're really excited about your diet, you might even feel great about it. So that's why you see so many people saying, I went virtually no carb, or I went really low fat, or all animal product, or all plant product, and everybody's stoked about it and everybody feels good.
Yeah, there are about a half dozen different redundant pathways to accomplish virtually anything that you'd want to do, with very few exceptions. Like, essential amino acids, there are a handful that your body can't manufacture itself. Most other things you'd want to do related to energy metabolism, there are a lot of roads that lead to Rome.
Exactly. So when our body's breaking down carbs, a lot of times what we're trying to basically get to, the kind of end destination, is let's turn this into some pyruvate or some acetyl CoA, and let's plug those into the pathways of energy metabolism. We can throw those, we can do glycolysis with carbs, obviously. We can also, throw that acetyl CoA into the Krebs cycle, use some of the products from there, throw them into the electron transport chain. We're using these kind of basic foundational building blocks that contain energy, throwing them through these pathways and getting ATP as a result. And whatever's left over, we can find a way to kind of make sure that we're storing fat when we have excess energy. And, we can do so much interconversion, because when we're breaking down carbs, when we're breaking down fats, when we're breaking down protein, after we kind of strip the amino group off of extra protein in the diet, we take that amino group off, and then we're left with what's left, and we can still turn that into pyruvate, turn that into acetyl CoA, or it'll turn into an intermediate that can go right into the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. So when we're talking about metabolism of carbs and fats and protein, it's kind of like dealing with currency. Like, we can exchange it when we need to exchange it. You're not going to end up with, a huge amount of currency and say, it's the wrong currency. There's just nothing I can do here. There are exchanges that are possible, and we're ultimately breaking it down into the same energy containing building blocks that we're throwing into pathways, whether those pathways are going toward creating ATP, or we're just funneling that towards storage for later use. So macronutrient metabolism is extremely flexible. If we have a bunch of extra calories coming in from fat, we can deal with that energy. And the way we deal with it is we either oxidize it for ATP in the short term, or we convert it to something that we can store for later. And in some cases, that will be fat. Now, a lot of times people will look at these types of questions and they will kind of skip a step and go straight to PubMed. Like, I think there's a lot of value. We've talked about this before. If you want to get a good handle on general metabolism, you want to start at the textbook rather than going straight to the individual experimental evidence, right? So sometimes I'll see people who are like looking for experimental evidence of protein getting directly converted to fat for storage. You want to take several steps back, get the lay of the land for metabolism, and then start looking for what actually happens in experimental conditions. So a great example that's analogous is a lot of times people will wonder if we can store extra carbs as fat. You know, if you have a really high carb diet and you're overfeeding. And it's the same kind of question. Do we have pathways where we can convert carbohydrate into fat and then store that? Sure, we do. But the body would much rather just burn off the extra carbs to the extent that it can and just store the dietary fat that's already fat. So a lot of times we'll see these really high carb overfeeding studies, and experimentally it looks like there's not a lot of conversion to fat, just straight conversion carb to fat. It doesn't mean it's not possible. It doesn't mean we don't have the pathways. It's just the body is crunching the numbers and saying, I'd much rather just oxidize the carbs and store the fat. And if I really must, then sure, I'll do some conversion of carbs to fat. So it's a kind of a similar deal with protein. So yeah, protein, if we want to store it as fat, if we have to, we can ultimately convert it all the way down to like acetyl-CoA and then do lipogenesis with that acetyl-CoA, and we can store it away. So that's the short answer is, yeah, if you're overfeeding, whether you're overfeeding carb, fat, protein, whatever, there are going to be differences in the pathways getting utilized in terms of, what our body prefers to do in certain situations. The efficiency of fat storage will be different. So if you overfeed with 800 calories worth of carbs versus fat versus protein, you're probably going to have, just due to the thermic effect of feeding, the fat is going to get stored very, very easily. The thermic effect of carbohydrate is a little bit higher. We might not store it with the exact same efficiency. And then protein has the highest thermic effect. So if you were going to say, I'm going to overfeed no matter what with 1,000 extra calories on top of what I'm already eating, what can I overfeed and have the smallest relative amount of fat gain? It probably would go in that order, right? So you'd have an easier time storing the most fat tissue coming from fat as in an overfeeding scenario, slightly less with carbs, but it's kind of negligible, and then slightly less again with protein due to the thermic effect. Now, one thing that I think is important to recognize when it comes to the specific studies being mentioned here by Antonio and colleagues, this is no fault of the participants or the researchers. I want to say that on the front end here. But I am very skeptical about the idea that there's these 800 extra calories and we simply don't know where they're going. I'm also skeptical that it's just 800 calories of like straight thermogenesis. Like that doesn't line up well with our understanding of metabolism and energetics. I think what you have to keep in mind with the studies by Antonio is these are free living participants and self-reported dietary data. So I think a really informative paper is one by Hahn and colleagues. Cody Hahn is actually one of our coaches at Stronger by Science. But they did a study where they had 3 different overfeeding conditions. And in one of them, they were trying to get people to just ramp up their whey protein week over week over week. So they said like week 1 here, take some protein, but week 2 and week 3 and week 4, all the way to week 6, they were supposed to increase their protein intake by 25 grams every single week. And what happened in that study over 6 weeks, and they did very, very thorough nutrition reporting, it just didn't happen. Like the people started on high protein diets. And if you've ever tried to go from like a very high protein diet to a very, very high protein diet, it's not fun.
No.
And like you would only do it if you literally had to.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, they basically started around like 175 grams a day of protein. and they were supposed to increase 25 grams every week for 6 weeks. They ended up getting to like 195 or 200 and being like, whatever, dude, I'm done. And actually their total calorie intake was lower than the other two groups because, trying to force feed yourself whey protein, it sucks. And it's also very satiating. So what you'll find is if you're trying to give yourself 300 grams of weight or of protein a day, mostly coming from whey, you're probably going to find that you're not eating much else because you're very, very full. And unless someone's making you do it, you're probably going to do that for like 3 days and be like, this sucks. I'm not going to do this anymore.
So I've got a story related to that. I don't know if I've talked about this on the podcast before. I feel like I have, but I'm not positive. But back in the day, when I was like maybe 19 or 20 or so, I learned about DC like style bodybuilding, like dog crap training. And, so I got into all of that, and there's nutrition recommendations that go along with it. And I don't remember all of them, but one of the kind of bedrocks, like one of the cornerstones of nutrition advice in that community is just like, regardless of the details, just eat like 400 or 500 grams of protein per day, and everything else will more or less sort itself out. So I was like, okay, cool. Like I'll give that a shot. So I tried, like I was tracking everything, and I was averaging something north of 400 grams of protein for like 2 weeks. And I just said, fuck that. Like I can't do this. I can maybe shoot for 300 grams per day. And like I was in college as well. Like I had a meal plan. But like the cafeteria didn't have many like good, relatively low calorie, high protein options. So what my diet looked like at the time is they had this little salad bar where you could put like little cubes of ham on top of your salad. And like deli ham is pretty lean. So I would just like go and get a plate and just load it up with like little like tiny cubed ham slices and just eat that with little like ham cubes and just eat that with a spoon. Which I imagine is probably more satiating than whey protein. And also ham is very salty. So I think
I was going to say, I hope that your blood pressure isn't too responsive to dietary sodium.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think I'm like a sodium blood pressure responder. But over just like the first week of doing that, I put on like 8 pounds, which I think was 100% water retention from how much deli ham I was eating. But yeah, that shit was fucking miserable, dude.
Yeah.
So anyone who is actually following that dietary advice, I don't think you benefit from eating that much protein, but if you are doing that and doing it consistently, you have a lot more willpower to eat protein than I do.
Yeah. So, like I said, there's a study by Hahn and colleagues which gives a window into like what is the likelihood that a lot of people really are just going like 4.5 grams per kilogram per day and not having a huge like kind of like non-volitional reduction in calorie intake, or at least just a total replacement of their calories that would have been carbs and fat, just replacing that with protein. I mean, when you look at really meticulously reported studies like the one by Hahn and colleagues, you'll see it's not very typical for people to be able to say, oh yeah, I'll just like triple my protein intake or double it, and I'll just leave everything else the same. Like it's not easy to do.
Yeah.
And there's also a study by Bray and colleagues in 2012 where they did very rigorous overfeeding with varying levels of protein. So like the levels of protein were 5% of energy up to 25% of energy, which I think spanned all the way from like right around the RDA, like close to that, like 0.7 or 0.8 grams per kilogram, all the way up to like 3 grams per kilogram. And this study was complete inpatient metabolic ward. Every calorie that these individuals consumed for the study period, and I think it was 8 weeks, which is really impressive if that's the case, every morsel they ate was prepared and provided by the research staff, and every instance of them consuming calories was supervised by the research staff. And in that scenario, there was nothing weird about protein overfeeding. There was no like loophole where it's like, man, these are like free calories. Everything made sense in terms of the amount of fat mass that was gained and the amount of fat-free mass that was gained. So with protein overfeeding, the closer you get to really tightly controlled designs, the more protein overfeeding completely makes sense and does exactly what you'd expect. The additional calories, there's a little bit of increase in energy expenditure due to the thermic effect of feeding. That might have a little impact on the propensity to store fat just because of burning calories. Nothing biochemically weird about that. And then the fat-free mass, it really just comes down to, if you're having a huge increase in protein intake from a very low protein diet, you're probably going to store some extra fat-free mass just because you were under eating protein previously. But yeah, I know that there are some studies floating around that make it seem like there's some weird biochemical stuff going on with protein overfeeding, almost like it's some kind of biochemistry loophole that gives you free calories. It's really not the case. And unfortunately, the calories that are going in are going to be dealt with either through an increase in thermogenesis or just storage of tissue. So that's it. Yeah. So high protein overfeeding, can it lead to fat gain? Absolutely. And that fat gain is very much in line with what we would calculate based on our understanding of metabolism.
Mhm.